What's up, everyone? It's Josh over here with the Manchise, and we are breaking down another Fight Night card for you. Of course, this one is over on Fight Island, Yaz Island, and it's Holm versus Irene Aldana as the main event. And I gotta be honest, this card doesn't have a ton of talent on it, but there is always money to be made when it comes to DFS, man. And this is where you can get your leg up in the competition, because I don't expect too many casual entries here. And if you know your stuff, you can make some money. You know, last weekend was crazy with the pay-per-view event, Paulo Costa versus Israel Adesanya, which we're going to recap in a few minutes here. But those tournaments were filling left and right since it was a big card. A lot of these tournaments, man, these are the types of cards that you can win money. And I've had a lot of success with these types of cards. But I got to be honest, man, you got a lot of UFC newcomers, a lot of people with just not impressive resumes or records. But let's see if we can pinpoint some fighters so that you guys can win some money, whether you're betting through a bookie or you're a DFS guy like me. Quick recap of last weekend, man. It was probably my roughest weekend since I've started doing these videos. It's probably been, like 6 months now. You know, I was all over Paulo Costa. He just didn't show up for the fight. Now, in DFS, he didn't really kill me because I did have a decent amount of exposure to Adesanya as well. But Dominic Reyes really killed me. I did not have enough exposure to Jan Blachowicz, and I just had too many lineups with that Reyes-Costa combo, and yeah, man, it killed me. So after doing well 2 weeks ago, you know, had a rough weekend last weekend, but I think we'll be in a good spot this weekend. I have some plays for you guys, so definitely tune in for the rest of this video as we go through this card, break it down. I'm going to be probably a little bit quicker than I normally am with this card, just because, you know, there's a lot of fighters on here, as I mentioned, that are either making their UFC debut or, you know, they're veterans that are on the back nine of their career. We'll get things started here with the main event, which is a fight taking place in the bantamweight division between Holm and Irene Aldana. We'll start off with Holm, 13-5 record, right? Former UFC champion, veteran in the game, coming up against a promising up-and-comer Irene Aldana. And what I think, you know, it is the headliner, so it's easy to say this, but it probably is the best bout on this card here on Fight Island. Holm, she's 3-2 in her last 5 fights, man. You know, she lost to Cyborg. She's lost to Amanda Nunes. She's fought just about everyone. She's fought Ronda Rousey. She's been in there with all of the GOATs. But her most recent fight 8 months ago, victory over Raquel Pennington, that one went the distance, picked up the victory, just had better output, really, in that fight. For Irene Aldana, she's on a nice little 2-fight win streak, victories over Vanessa Mello, and you know, the real impressive one 9 months ago when she knocked out Ketlin Vieira, which was super surprising. I didn't even see that one coming. 4-1 in her most 5 recent UFC fights. The only loss was a loss to Rocky Pennington that went the distance, split decision loss. So it was a close fight, so they do have a common opponent there. The odds in this fight are actually pretty close. Holm's only -120, Irene Aldana's +100. You know, what I will say about this fight is, stylistically, these are two females with a boxing background. And this fight is 5 rounds. I expect it to go the distance. Neither of these females have really high finishing percentages. And I would expect that most of this fight takes place standing on the feet, with both these girls trading back and forth. Now, we've seen Holm in her most recent couple fights. Really, you got to go back 2 years ago, I think, is when we saw a big change in her style of fighting, when she fought Megan Anderson. And she really relied on her grappling, her wrestling, and her takedowns. And we've seen her now kind of evolve as a fighter and mix that into her game. I think it would be beneficial for her to rely on that here against Aldana, but it is going to be difficult because Irene Aldana has a 93% takedown defense in the UFC, so she's not an easy fighter to get to the ground. So that's why, based on that information, I think this fight will go back and forth. It's a tough fight for Aldana because generally when she is fighting an opponent in the UFC, she has a significant boxing advantage. That won't be the case here. Obviously, Holly Holm, world champion boxer, just has a ridiculous boxing pedigree. With that being said, though, one of the stats that I do want to point out is just the difference in their output. Irene Aldana, she lands 6.16 significant strikes per minute to Holly Holm's 2.75. So she's definitely the more active fighter in the octagon. Hey, I lean Holly Holm in this fight. The reason why, I just think she has, more tools, and there's more ways for her to get the job done here. Like I said, I expect it to go the distance, but I think Holly Holm wins this fight by decision. Would it surprise? I'm not super confident in that pick, in all honesty. This is a fight that I probably wouldn't bet. And Vegas suggests it's a near pick'em fight. I wouldn't be surprised if Holly Holm didn't win, though, just because it's a fight that's going to go the distance. Judges' scorecards, you never know what you're going to get. And with Irene Aldana really being the more active, higher output fighter, she could win. She could win rounds, especially if she can avoid the takedown attempts from Holly Holm that I think we'll inevitably see here, especially early on in the fight. And if Holly Holm's unable to get her to the ground, then she's got to go tit for tat with Irene Aldana. And she definitely has the credentials to do so. But as I mentioned, we haven't seen Holly Holm really fight with the same amount of output as we have seen Irene Aldana in her most recent fights. Now, again, she isn't fighting the same level of competition. Holm's been out there with everyone. When it comes to DraftKings, man, and DFS, I really like Irene Aldana here. And the reason for that is she's priced down at 7,800 and she's a high volume striker. So even though this is a fight where I really think it could go either way, I'm going to have much more exposure to Aldana because it's a 5-round fight. So it's a fight I definitely want to have exposure to. And she's an underdog, but she's the more active fighter, and she's not fighting a fighter that has a high finishing percentage. So, if you look in the UFC, man, some of her most recent performances: 113 points, 93 points, 90 points, 103 points. Even in her losses, 42 against Chikagian, 59 against Smith. So, and those were 3-round fights where she's landing 190 significant strikes. So I love her here at 7,800. For Holly Holm at 8,400, I think she's going to be one of the more popular fighters on this slate. She's someone that, I'll have exposure to as well because, as I mentioned, 5-round fight, main event, definitely want exposure to that. I think it's going to go the distance. And she's not priced up at an astronomical price. At 8,400, she puts up 90 points. You're in a good spot there. She may be optimal. I'll have a little bit of exposure to her. This is also a fight that I think you could stack, especially if you're playing cash, because if it goes the distance and Aldana lands 150 significant strikes, Holly Holm matches that pace, they're both going to pay up at their price points. In GDPs, it's difficult to win GDPs, or it's rare to win a GDP and have a fighter or have a combination, a stack in place, but it's possible, and it has happened before. So I probably will still have a few tournament entries sprinkled in with those two fighters stacked, but for the most part, I'm going to pick one or the other and definitely have a little bit more exposure to Irene Aldana. So we'll move on to the co-main event and I feel like I said this a few months ago when the whole COVID outbreak or pandemic took place. Like, there were some sloppy cards. At some point, I think it was the Tim Elliott versus Ryan Benoit fight, where I said this has got to be one of the worst co-main events of all time. Well, Yorgan De Castro versus Carlos Felipe will give it a run for its money. Now, I think I would give a slight edge to this fight because it is at heavyweight, and typically you see finishes occur in the heavyweight division. So I'll give it a slight edge. It's a better co-main event than Tim Elliott and Ryan Benoit, but it's still not the best co-main event I've ever seen because these guys aren't the most talented fighters. I think Yorgan De Castro, I would still, even though he's coming off of a loss, I would still consider him a prospect in the heavyweight division. He's 6-1, right? He lost that fight to Greg Hardy, who is a very difficult opponent for any heavyweight. But before that, man, he looked great on the Contender Series. Also had that UFC debut where he knocked out Justin Tafa. Yorgan De Castro has heavy hands, man, and he's not afraid to mix in calf kicks, which is something that you always like to see from heavyweights who generally are just going to trade bombs. Carlos Felipe, he fought 2 months ago against Sergey Spivak. He lost that fight. It went the distance. And Sergey Spivak, not a great heavyweight in my opinion. He was someone that I was pinpointing in that fight just because Carlos Felipe, man, he just hadn't been the most active fighter. It was hard to get good footage on him. And though his record was 8-0 at the time, you just didn't know what you were getting from him. So now I've been able, I was able to watch that fight. I can see why Carlos Felipe was 8-0. He's got pretty good boxing skills. He'll throw it. He relies on his jab. Though he has a bunch of knockouts on his resume, I mean, the guys, his opponents that he was fighting were all trash cans. I don't know if he's, they're heavyweights, right? So you land flush, you land clean, you can put someone down just based on your sheer size, walking around in that cage at 265 pounds. But I don't know if he has scary knockout power in his hands. Right, he definitely doesn't have the same power that Greg Hardy has, and Yorgan De Castro was able to go the distance with Greg Hardy. I look at the odds in this fight, and they make total sense to me. Yorgan De Castro is -245. Carlos Felipe is +205. That makes sense. I think this is Yorgan De Castro's fight to lose here. I think he hits harder. I think he is the better MMA fighter because he can mix in some of those kick techniques as well. They're basically identical in size, and this fight to me, I would feel comfortable betting Yorgan De Castro at -245. When it comes to DraftKings, man, Yorgan De Castro is priced at 8,900. That makes sense to me, right? I mean, in his first fight, he racked up 102 points. He only landed 24 significant strikes against Greg Hardy. Greg Hardy was just a bigger fighter, more athletic fighter in that fight, but it's still a good sign that he was able to go the distance in that fight against Greg Hardy. So I will have a lot of exposure to Yorgan De Castro. Carlos Felipe, on the other hand, priced down at 7,300. He's a GPP dart throw for me all day. Heavyweight, co-main event. It's a fight that you want to have exposure to on this card. And he's a guy that you can throw in there and maybe he'll break the slate, right? Like he could knock out Yorgan De Castro. If he wins the fight in any capacity, he'll pay up to that 7,300 value. So I'm not super confident in him. I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to Carlos Felipe, but I may have some contrarian lineups where I sprinkle him in order to diversify. I think there's better options in the 7,000 price point. And in all honesty, I don't think this is a card where you have great options in the high 8s or low 9K range where you need to dive or dig deep and grab fighters that are priced at the low 7 or high 6 salaries. So we'll move on to the next fight on the main card. Germaine de Randamie versus Juliana Pena. In all honesty, I think this would be a better co-main event. Germaine de Randamie, the Iron Lady, 9-4 in the UFC, coming off of a loss to Amanda Nunes 9 months ago. But before that, really strung together some victories in the UFC that were pretty impressive. She knocked out Anna Elmos. She beat Holly Holm. She beat Rocky Pennington. She knocked out Aspen Ladd. For Juliana Pena, she's 9-3. She's 4-1 in her 5 most recent UFC fights. She has some pretty impressive victories as well. Victories over Jessica Ai, Kat Zingano, and then most recently against Nico Montano. Her one loss was to Valentina Shevchenko, who's, a stud. But Juliana Pena is going to have, she's going to have a lot on her hands here, man, fighting against de Randamie. I'll tell you that. With Shevchenko was able to pull an armbar and sub Juliana Pena, which just shows you how good and how impressive Shevchenko is, because that's Juliana Pena's game. Like, that's her bread and butter. She wants to take you to the ground and pound you, or submit you. For Juliana Pena, she's not a bad striker, but it's just, that's not her preference. And in this fight, you know, Germaine de Randamie is going to have a huge striking advantage. So to me, what this fight comes down to is whether or not Germaine de Randamie can prevent the takedowns. And, you know, she struggled with that against Amanda Nunes. But outside of Amanda Nunes, she's been really strong at preventing takedowns. She got a 71% takedown defense, right? Like, Aspen Ladd wasn't able to really get her to the ground and do much. So I think in this fight, I like de Randamie. I'm pulling up the odds here. De Randamie's at minus 150 at this point, so it looks like some money's been dumped on her. And that makes sense to me, because if she prevents the takedown, she wins this fight all day standing. For Juliana Pena, you know, she could win the fight. She's got to get it to the ground, control de Randamie, and either land a bunch of significant strikes or submit de Randamie. You know, if Amanda Nunes couldn't submit de Randamie, I don't know if Juliana Pena can. When it comes to DFS for this fight, this isn't a fight that I'm necessarily targeting, simply because this is a fight that I expect to go the distance. I think de Randamie is able to prevent the takedowns, land significant strikes. But de Randamie's not a high output fighter either. In fact, she hovers around 3 significant strikes landed per minute. It's not great. She's priced up at 8,600. Now, she's had performances in the octagon where she's paid up to that price, right? Like, she put up 112 against Elmos. She put up 102 against Ladd. 70 against Holm, but that was a 5-round fight, right? So like 70 points in 5 rounds isn't great. I mean, I will have some exposure to de Randamie, but it's just not a fight that I'm really targeting. And for Juliana Pena at 7,600, I don't love her. I just think there's better options, right? So she had those 2 early KO victories in the beginning of her career in the UFC. Outside of that, 69 points against Montano, 19 against Shevchenko, 64 against Ngannou, 80 against I. Not horrible, but not really what I'm looking for when I think she's going to be at such a disadvantage striking in this match. So I have a feeling Juliana Pena is going to be pretty popular on this slate, but I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid this weekend. And hey, who knows, maybe I'll be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that de Randamie is able to pull out a victory here in this one. So we'll move on to the next fight, which is a fight taking place in the, I believe it's taking place in the bantamweight division. Yes. Kyler Phillips versus Cameron Else. Cameron Else is making his UFC debut. He is 10-4. He's on a nice little 5-fight win streak. All of those victories were finishes. He's got a 100% finish rate, I believe, in his professional career. Taking on Kyler Phillips, who's 7-1. We've only seen him once in the UFC. 6 months ago, he beat Gabriel Silva. Looked pretty impressive. This is the thing with Kyler Phillips, man. He's got decent... He's just a good all-around fighter. Decent striking, pretty good jiu-jitsu, was a Contender Series veteran, and a huge favorite in this fight. Cameron Else is also taking this fight on short notice, about a week's heads up. I want to see what Cameron Else looks like on the scales, because he's also fought at featherweight. So, we'll see if it ends up being a tough weight cut for him since he's taking the fight on short notice. Who knows? That will sway my opinion a little bit, at least when it comes to putting together my lineups. There's no money to be made here. Kyler Phillips is like minus 425 or something crazy like that. I'm just pulling it up now. Minus 470 at this point. So not a fight that I'm looking to bet, but Cameron Else looks tough. I don't know if and Phillips doesn't have a super high finish rate, so with those odds, man, you'd be crazy to bet Kyler Phillips with those odds. When it comes to Cameron Else, if you're not familiar with him, I was able to watch some of his fights. He looked good in his fights, man. Decent striking, good jiu-jitsu. I don't want to say good jiu-jitsu skills, but he had some decent jiu-jitsu skills, some decent submissions that I saw, some chokes, guillotines, rear naked chokes. The guy's fought for Cage Warriors, so he's fought decent talent. But, man, when I look at his resume, some of the records, Brad Evans was his most recent victory, 3-14. Mark Stevens, 0-1. Aiden James, 4-0. Tom Major, 0-0. Thomas Turgeman, 1-1. This guy has fought nothing but trash cans. And for that reason alone, I just don't feel confident about him here. So I think Kyler Phillips gets the job done here. When it comes to DFS, not a fight that I want to have a ton of exposure to. I don't want to pay up 9,200 for Kyler Phillips. It just seems crazy to me if there isn't, a high percentage of getting a finish, and I don't necessarily think there is. And for Cameron Else at 7K, he's the ultimate dart throw this week. The ultimate. Can he continue this nice little finishing streak? Maybe. I don't think he's not going to be a popular pick in DFS, right? I think Kyler Phillips will definitely be a chalky pick this week because he's the biggest favorite on the card. Just be careful, man. Just watch out for Cameron Else, man. If you're putting together a couple tournament plays, you throw Cameron Else in there in a lineup here or there, and he's a guy that could certainly break the slate. So I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to this fight, but I might have a few lineups where I sprinkle Cameron Else in. I don't think, I'm not thinking he's going to win. But if he does, he's going to be in the optimal, right? So we'll move on to the next fight, just taking place in the middleweight, these guys are going to be fighting at, middleweight, 185. It's Daquan Townsend versus Dusko Todorovic. Dusko Todorovic is making his UFC debut here. This guy was on the Contender Series, got a victory, before he's 9-0. He's looked super impressive leading up to his UFC debut here with a pretty high finishing rate. I believe it's close to 90%, and because he's got TKOs, KOs, rear naked chokes, guillotine chokes. The guy is coming into this fight and he's looking to make a name for himself and stamp himself as a top prospect in the middleweight division. Daquan Townsend, well, he's 0-3 in the UFC thus far, and just hasn't looked great. He was knocked out by Dalcha Lujambula. He lost the fight to Bevan Lewis, and he also lost his most recent fight 7 months ago to Devin Clark. For Townsend, he's just not a top talent fighter, man. I know he's 21-11, has a lot of experience. He does have some power. I think his finishing rate is somewhere around 80% as well. So if he lands, he could put you out, but he's just not the most polished striker. He's not the most polished grappler. He's going to struggle against any UFC fighters that are super talented in one area or one, if they're a great grappler, they're gonna have no trouble taking Townsend down. If they're a great striker, they're not gonna have trouble striking against Townsend. So this is another one where Todorovic is a pretty big favorite on this card at -340. Makes total sense. Now, I watched a bunch of Todorovic fights and highlights. He's impressive, but it wasn't like, when I watched the Romanov highlights, I'm like, all right, this guy is going to be a force in the UFC. Todorovic knows how to win. If he lands clean, he'll finish you. If the fight goes down to the mat, he's got good submission skills. He could get you out with a choke. But there wasn't anything that made me think like, oh, this guy's going to be a champion in the UFC that I witnessed. With that being said, this is a pretty easy opponent to make your UFC debut with. So like if he can't get Townsend out of here, then your expectations for Todorovic definitely go down. This is another fight that's going to be hard to make money off of because of the odds, but I'm pretty confident in Todorovic here. When it comes to DFS, Todorovic is priced up at 9,100. I like him. Out of all the 9K options, Jourdain, Phillips, Kenny, and Todorovic, I like Todorovic best because I think he has that fight is more likely to end in a finish than some of the other fights. Because Kyler Phillips, Kenny, I mean, those guys are at smaller weight classes. Those are fights that are just more likely to go the distance. Even Jourdain, for me this week it was, do I pay up for Jourdain or do I pay up for Todorovic? For me, I think I'll have more exposure to Todorovic. Townsend at 7,100. I don't know, man. I don't think I'll have too much exposure to him. I mean, he's got a high finishing rate, so again, he's a guy. He's a GPP dart throw. I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to him, but he's a guy that would break the slate if he pulls out a victory, especially if he finishes Todorovic. So, trail me here on this one with Todorovic and definitely get some exposure to him. So we'll move on to the next fight, which is the featured prelim, which is a fight between Carlos Cooked Condit and Court Cooked McGee. Both these guys are cooked and they're on the back nine of their MMA careers. Carlos Condit has impressively strung together 5 losses in the UFC. Losses to Robbie Lawler, Damian Maia, Neil Magny, Alex Oliveira, and Michael Chiesa. Court McGee, on the flip side, 1-4 in his 5 most recent fights, right? His only victory was to Alex Garcia, but he's lost to Sean Brady, Diego Lima, Sean Strickland, Ben Saunders. You guys know these fighters. They've been in the UFC forever. This fight is a near pick'em. Court McGee's minus 135. Carlos Condit's plus 115. I don't need to get into all the stats and break down everything in this fight. What I'm going to tell you is Court McGee wins this fight. Court McGee wins this fight because Court McGee is the more durable fighter, and even though he's been on a losing skid, he has looked way more impressive than Carlos Condit. And Carlos Condit's takedown defense is nothing at this point in his career. I expect Court McGee to enter the octagon, press Condit up against the cage, take him down, and then have his way with him on the ground and land some significant strikes. Right? Like, that's the blueprint for beating Carlos Condit. And Carlos Condit isn't the scary striker that you thought he once was. And honestly, it's quite the shame, because if you look at his victories, man, he hasn't been good since like 2012 when he beat Nick Diaz, Dong Hyun Kim, Dan Hardy, and Rory McDonald, and Jake Ellenberger. I mean, since then, it's just been lost to George St. Pierre, lost to Johnny Hendricks, lost to Tyron Woodley. His victory, you sprinkle in there, Martin Kampman sucks. Thiago Alves, he's also cooked. So at least Court McGee has been in there, had some victories over guys like Alex Garcia and Dominique Steele, even a victory over Robert Whittaker. I'm just way more confident in him, and based on that, I'm confident in Court McGee for DFS as well. Love him here at 8,300. Think he's going to secure some takedowns, win the fight. You're probably going to need to get exposure to someone in the low 8s. Pivot away from Holly Holm here. Put Court McGee in your lineup. Carlos Condit, I will have no exposure to at 7,900. I mean, 8 points, 22 points, 19 points, 1 point in his 4 most recent UFC fights. I just don't like him here at all. So get some exposure to Court McGee. All right, moving on to the next prelim here, which is a fight taking place in the featherweight division between Charles Jourdain and Joshua Coulibaly. We'll start with Joshua Coulibaly, man. He's 8-1. His only loss as a professional took place 7 months ago when he was knocked out by Jalen Turner in his UFC debut. This is a guy that I believe trains with Team Alpha Male. So he was 7-0 coming into that UFC debut. But I'll tell you this, watching that fight against Jalen Turner, it was evident that there are levels to the game. And he just didn't look like a UFC caliber fighter, in my opinion. Which is interesting since he fights and trains with Team Alpha Male. For Charles Jourdain, he's a guy who's 1-2 in the UFC. So he's got a victory where he knocked out Doo Ho Choi. He also has a loss to Des Green, and he just lost to Andre Fili, split decision, which, I don't know. I thought Fili did enough to win that fight unanimously. This is another one where you have crazy odds here. Jourdain is -450, Coulibaly is +360. It makes total sense. I don't know if there's anything that Coulibaly does better than Charles Jourdain, and that's a problem. And as I already mentioned, I don't think Coulibaly really looks like UFC caliber talent. I guess the only thing that you could say that is in Coulibaly's favor here is that he will have a little bit of a size advantage. He is an inch taller, and he'll have a 4-inch reach advantage, but I don't think it matters here. Charles Jourdain is the more polished striker. I also think Charles Jourdain, if this turned into a grappling match, which I don't necessarily think it will, is the better grappler as well. I think Charles Jourdain, he's just, this fight's going to stay standing. There's no reason to break down the grappling statistics in this one. This fight stays standing. Jourdain, higher output fighter, more striking accuracy, absorbs less strikes per minute, has looked more impressive in the octagon than Coulibaly. So I think, Coulibaly is dropping down to featherweight here. I think in his first fight against Jalen Turner, he took that fight at lightweight. So, and this makes sense. Featherweight makes more sense based on his size, but it still doesn't scare me. I don't think that him being a little bit taller and having a little bit more reach really is going to present problems for Charles Jourdain in this fight. Again, another fight you're not going to make a ton of money off of, so I'm not going to be placing any money on this one. Charles Jourdain at 9,300. I've talked about this on for DraftKings, DFS. If you're going to get 9K exposure this week, you're probably contemplating either having Todorovic or Jourdain in your lineup. I know Kyler Phillips is going to be a chalky play as well. I'll have a little bit of exposure to Jourdain at 9,300. In his fight against Choi, he landed 64 significant strikes, had 2 knockdowns, was able to eventually get him out of there with a TKO, and he put up 122 points. So we've seen him do it before, man. We've seen him put up big numbers, but that's what you're going to need for him here if you're going to pay 9,300 for him. So I'll have a little bit of Jourdain. I will not have any of Coulibaly. He is the lowest or the cheapest priced fighter on the slate at 6,900. It makes sense. His one UFC fight, he put up a whopping 6 fantasy points, and that could happen again here, man. I just don't have any confidence in him. So I will be fading Coulibaly. All right, we'll move on to the next fight on the prelims here, which is a fight between Jordan Williams and Nasruddin Imavov. This is a fight you would definitely want to have exposure, and this is a fight that I am looking forward to breaking down, man. We'll start with Jordan Williams, 9-3. Oh, and just to point out, this fight is taking place in the middleweight, 185-pound division. Jordan Williams, 9-3. This guy is a veteran of the Contender Series. Also fought for Bellator. He's been on the Contender Series multiple times, 3 times now. And he's looked good on the Contender Series, man. So in his most recent fight on the Contender Series, it was just a couple weeks ago, he was able to knock out Gregory Rodriguez. I was able to watch that fight. Jordan Williams, I will say this. Guy's got pretty heavy hands. It doesn't look like he throws that hard, but when he lands, he puts people out. And if you look at his record, he's 9-3, but most of his victories have been finishes, which is what you love to see. He has also, before I move on to my next train of thought here, he has also been finished. Dwight Grant, another UFC veteran, was able to knock him out, and he fought Rodrigo Vargas a few years ago and got nicked up pretty bad in that one, and Doctor had to come in and stop that one. That's just his style of fighting, in all honesty. If you watch his fights in the Contender Series, you will see that Jordan Williams has no problem taking one to give one. For Nasruddin Imavov, he is 8-2, and he is on a nice little win streak here, man. 5 most recent fights. He's put together a nice string of victories. This guy's nickname is the Russian Sniper, and he's making his UFC debut here. He's definitely the more well-rounded fighter in this fight. Decent striking, decent grappling, solid jiu-jitsu skills. I look at his resume. He's got rear naked chokes, guillotine chokes, key locks. So, like to see a fighter that can pull off those submissions in the octagon. This is an interesting one for me because the other thing about this fight is Imavov has a size advantage. Their reach is about the same, but Imavov's going to be about 3 inches taller in the octagon, which will help him control distance in those striking exchanges. Why this is interesting is because Jordan Williams is a minus 145 favorite. I guess it's because he's had now some UFC type experience with, he's been under the bright lights of the Contender Series, been under the bright lights of fighting for Bellator, whereas Imavov has fought for smaller organizations. But I like Imavov in this fight. I just think he's the Russian Sniper, right? So that means he should be more technical and tactical with the strikes that he lands. And in all honesty, watching both of them fight, it wasn't like I was watching Jordan Williams and was saying, wow, he's going to have a big striking advantage in this fight. I don't think he will. He might be the more powerful puncher, but, you got to land the strikes to get your opponent out of there. And sometimes he's a little reckless defensively. If this fight turns into a clinch grappling situation or it goes to the ground, I really like Imavov in that scenario. I think he has an advantage here. So I'm surprised Jordan Williams is the favorite. I get it that he has a little bit more experience, but this is still his UFC debut. So I like Imavov here as a dog. Get him at plus 125. That's solid odds. When it comes to DFS, Jordan Williams is 8,700. Imavov is 7,500. Imavov is my favorite dog on this slate outside of Aldana. So I'm going to have a ton of exposure to him. Just makes sense. Price down at 7,500, fighting another guy that's making his UFC debut, and he has arguably an edge in grappling and jiu-jitsu, and he's really not that far off when it comes to striking. In fact, he may be the better striker. So I really like Imavov. I will stay away from Jordan Williams, but this is a fight you probably want to have exposure to. I might have Jordan Williams sprinkled in a few lineups just because he has a high finish rate, but definitely will side or will have more exposure to Imavov in this fight. So we'll move on to the next fight on the card here, which is a fight that's taking place in the women's strawweight division, 115 pounds. Loma Lookboon versus Jinyu Frey. I think it's pronounced Fry, even though there's an E in there. I could be wrong on that. So we'll start with Loma. She's 4-2. girl that's fought for Invicta. She's 1-1 in the UFC. She won a split decision victory in her UFC debut against Alexandra Albu, but she lost the fight 7 months ago to Angela Hill. For Jinyu Fry, she is 0-1 in the UFC. She was subbed. I think it was a triangle armbar. Yes, triangle armbar by Kay Hansen 3 months ago. She's another girl that's fought for Invicta. She's fought for Ryzen as well. 9-5 professional record. I mean, both these girls are strikers. I expect this fight to stay standing, and Jinyu Fry has a size advantage in this one. She's 2 inches taller. She also has a 3-inch reach advantage. Is she as good as a striker as Loma Lookboon? Probably not. Loma trains Tiger Muay Thai, so she's got serious Muay Thai skill, but she just has no power. I mean, this fight is a guaranteed 100% lock to go the distance. If you're going to bet anything on this fight, bet the overs, but I'm sure the odds for that are not very good. I want to pull up some stats for this fight. Loma Lookboon, 5.7 significant strikes landed per minute with a 54% striking accuracy. So those numbers are solid numbers, and though this isn't a fight that I would generally look to have exposure to, Lookboon is priced at $8,500, and you could do worse because she put up 85 points against Albu, only 32 points against Angela Hill in a loss. Yeah, man, it's tough to get exposure to this fight, and it's tough to bet this fight because I could just see it going either way because it's going to be in the judges' hands. For Fry, she's priced down at $7,700. She's not a bad underdog to have some exposure to, just because I don't see this fight ending in a finish. Someone's got to win. Who knows? Maybe it's Fry. I don't think she's nearly as good of a striker, but she's got a size advantage. Maybe she can use that to her advantage in this one and squeak out a victory against Loma Lookboon. And if she's able to do that, then she might put up 70, 75 points, and you could do worse at 7,700 on DraftKings. Moving on to the next fight, prelims here, Casey Kenny versus Hailai Alateng. This fight is, of course, taking place in the bantamweight division. We'll start off with Casey Kenny, who is 14-2 as a professional, pretty impressive. And he's been pretty strong in the UFC, man. He's 3-1 in the UFC. Before that, fought in the LFA. But listen to some of his opponents. Ray Borg that he has a victory over. Manny Bermudez, and then most recently, he subbed Luis Smolka, which Smolka's been hot and cold in the UFC. His only loss was to Merab Valashivli, where, Valashivli's just going to take you to the mat. Take you to the mat, and control you. Very tough opponent. For Hailai Alateng, he is 2-0 in the UFC. Victory over Dana Batcherel and a victory over Ryan Benoit. Both of those went the distance. Neither of these guys have high finishing percentages. Casey Kenny, I know, did sub the guillotine choke Luis Smolka in his most recent victory, but these guys are 135ers. Neither of them are heavy punchers, and neither of them are just experts at jiu-jitsu. They're similar in size. Kenny will be an inch taller. He'll have an 1.5 inch reach advantage as well. Kenny's a huge favorite here. Makes sense to me. He's fought tougher competition. I've watched these guys fight. He looks like the more impressive fighter. But I do not love betting Casey Kenny at -325, and I don't see a ton of finishing potential in this fight. Alateng He's been really good dating all the way back to like 2015. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So in 11 fights, in his 11 most recent fights, he's only lost one of them. And that was back in 2017 when he was finished by Kai Asakura, who was an undefeated fighter at the time, by the way. So, betting this fight is not something I recommend. But when it comes to DFS, Alatang at 7,200, it's not a bad play. Not a bad play. See, this is a weird card because I feel like with breaking down a lot of these fights, I'm like, the underdog's not a bad play here. And the reason for that is because you don't have a ton of top-end talent on this card. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of underdogs won fights here and the optimal lineup had a ton of salary left over. In all honesty, I would not be surprised. So Casey Kenny, he's going to be hard for me to get to at 9K. You're going to have to spend money somewhere, and I do expect him to win. So I'll probably have a little bit exposure to him, but he's not my favorite 9K option. I mean, he 106 points against Smolka is nice. Before that, 23 against Valashivli, 88 against Bermudez, 83 against Borg. Not bad numbers. But for Alatang, priced all the way down at 7,200, 69 points against Batgirl and 74 points against Benoit, that's not bad. Like, if he puts up 74, 75 points here, priced down at 7,200, like, he'll probably end up in the optimal. I just don't see him finishing Kenny. This is another one that's gonna go the distance. All right, so we will move on to the first prelim of the night, a fight that's taking place at 155 pounds between Jason Ayari and Luigi Vendramini. So we'll start off with Jason Ayari, who is 1-2 in the UFC. He won his first fight against Jim Wallhead, split decision victory in that one, 4 years ago. Now, he hasn't been a super active fighter. And generally when you see some of these German or European fighters, they don't tend to be the most active fighters because they have to travel to the States to fight. After his victory against Jim Wallhead, he got paired up with Darren Till, and he lost that fight. Now, he did go the distance with Darren Till, which is pretty impressive. And then his most recent fight 2 years ago was against Stevie Ray. It's another fight he lost, but again, it went the distance. For Luigi Vendramini, his most recent fight 2 years ago, so neither of these guys have been very active. Vendramini was knocked out by Elizeu Zaleski, and it was a quick knockout, flying knee, flatlined him. But before that, he was 8-0 as a professional before he made that UFC debut, and that was a tough debut, a tough opponent to make that debut against. Here's the thing with Vendramini. He has a really high finishing rate. He's been able to knock out or submit a lot of his opponents, but the level of his opponents that he's fought just haven't been great. So this fight is basically a pick'em. Ayari now is a favorite at -120. Vendramini's +100. On some books, they're both -110. I focused some time here watching these fights because initially I really liked Vendramini when it came to DFS because of that high finishing percentage, but I just don't see him getting it done here. And it's because though those finishes, that finishing rate is impressive, the opponents that he got those finishes against were not impressive. And that's just what it comes down to, man. Vendramini is... he just doesn't look as polished of a striker and grappler as Jason Iari is. Like, Iari was competitive in his fights against Till and Stevie Ray. Super tough opponents. Vendramini is not on their level. So I actually like Iari here minus 120. I feel pretty comfortable betting that. And when it comes to DFS, this is your 8,200, 8,000 matchup here. I like Iari here at 8,200. This is a fight that you should target because, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of fights on this card that are difficult to target because they'll probably go the distance, right? You have female fights, you have the Casey Kenny, Alatang fight, you have the Kyler Phillips, Cameron Else fight, even the McGee Condit fight you might not see a finish in. So this is a fight that you probably want to have some exposure to, even though it's the first fight of the night. I'm going to side with Iari, but because these guys are so similar in their price points, I'll probably have a little bit of Vendramini as well. All right, so we're going to move on to the money-making segment, even though it wasn't much of a money-making segment last week. And I'm going to give you guys a free card here. We always start with the highest price fighters and make our way down to the cheapest fighters. So we're going to start off with Dusko Todorovic at 9,100. We'll then move on to Yorgan De Castro at 8,900. Court McGee at 8,300. Jason Iari at 8,200. Irene Aldana at 7,800. And then our boy Imavov at 7,500. So good luck this weekend, guys. As always, thanks for tuning in. If you guys could like and subscribe these videos. If I let you down this week, I'm looking to get you right back on the winning side of things this weekend. So let's make some cash. And again, thanks for tuning in.